Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the very first of this kind of units modules. So this is extra practice module 30, and it really is very similar to this unit in that we're going to try to basically put it all together. So the first module is long run implications of fiscal policy, deficits, and the debt. And there's some things in this that are important and some things that are not. The thing, talking about just the terminology of what a budget is, budget deficit, things like that, that's important. The cyclically adjusted budget balance, not important. It's useful, and if you plan on going on kind of into policy making, I think it's really interesting. And it kind of talks about maybe why that matters more than what just the budget deficit does. And then it's questions about should the budget be balanced, right? Which we talked about in some of these lectures and some of the long run implications of using debt and the problems associated with it. A lot of the AP test doesn't focus on that. There are some implications specific to econ, but it doesn't spend an enormous amount of time in that section. There's also this stuff about implicit liabilities. Again, not as important for the AP test, but again, still useful information to think about and thinking about policy. So let's get started. Check your understanding number one. So the first one says, why is the cyclically adjusted budget balance a better measure of long-run sustainability of policies than the actual budget balance? And I told you just now that the cyclically adjusted budget balance doesn't really matter as much for our exams, but in the distinction here is that it just takes into account the business cycle. So it would say, in a recession, it's taking into account the fact that automatic stabilizers move our budget into deficit. And so, using the adjusted value kind of allows us to kind of clear the effect of automatic stabilizers. Now, there are some people who would say, but you shouldn't do that. That in fact that's disingenuous to do that. But most policy projections kind of basically try to smooth that out. So we don't really want those to take that into account because we're trying to smooth it out. To take into account the business cycle, it's kind of like having a natural rate of unemployment and then having like what's the actual, and so that's the difference between the two. The second question says, explain why a state that's required to balance its budget is more likely to experience a more severe economic fluctuation than a state that doesn't. And that's true, of course, but it's because with a balanced, let's say, balanced budget requirement, the states can't as easily use automatic stabilizers. Because again, if like Missouri, for example, where I am, if you have a balanced budget requirement, then the state can't really borrow money and go into deficit spending. And so during a recession, they just cut spending. And that has the effect of actually making the recession worse. And there's lots of states that have that as part of their constitutional requirements. And it isn't necessarily a good thing for trying to smooth out the business cycle. There's sometimes an argument that the US Constitution should have a balanced budget amendment. And I'd say most economists would say that's a bad idea because you want the flexibility to be able to generate borrowing when you absolutely need to do it. So question 3 says, explain how each of the following events would affect the debt or implicit liabilities of the government, everything else being equal. Would the debt or liabilities be greater or smaller? So 3, and it says, and implicit liabilities is basically you're promising something that people in the future are going to have claim on. So like right now, there's Social Security is a good example of that, where you have tens of millions of workers who you've kind of promised that they will get something in the future. And so it's an implied liability because we owe them that, right? A liability is something you owe, but it's implied. So we don't really owe them that today, but 30 years from now we do. And so that's the implicit liability. The growth rate of real GDP goes up. So if that's the case, we can say that probably I would venture that that if that's happening, that public debt is probably decreasing, at least in the sense that if that's the case, because tax revenue is likely to be increasing. That would be my assumption on this one. I'm sorry, I'll just got to move that out of the way a little bit. Part B, retirees live longer. Well, if retirees are living longer, then Social Security and things like that is going to be higher. So liabilities would be increasing because increase what you owe to future, right? That's really what that one comes down to. C, tax revenue declines. And so that's a fairly straightforward, like debt would go up. D, the government borrows to pay interest on its current debt. Oh, that's a bad situation. That means you can't even afford your interest, so debt would be rising even faster. Question 4 says, suppose the economy is in a slump and the current debt is quite large. Explain the trade-off of short-run versus long-run objectives that policymakers face when deciding whether or not to engage in deficit spending. So the trade-off, right? The short-run versus long-run trade-off is the short run, you have the desire to fix, we'll kind of put that in air quotes, the economy via deficits, right? Deficit spending. But in the long run, that will slow the growth of the economy due to crowding out. Sorry, I'll kind of just zoom out because I'm noticing you can't see, due to crowding out. And that's the idea that, if the government debt is very large relative to the size of the economy, then other private borrowers and investment spending and consumption, they're not going to be able to afford. They're not going to be able to afford to borrow because the government's kind of vacuuming it up before it gets there. So that's the trade-off, right? You don't want to borrow too much because it sacrifices the future growth rates. But at the same time, in the short run, if the economy is in a bad spot, you feel like we owe something to the people in front of us right now. So let's take a look at these multiple choice questions. We'll leave that policy situation for you to figure out at a future date. If the government's spending exceeds tax revenues, which is true, that's a deficit. So that's 2 only B. It's just the definition. Number 2, which of the following fiscal policies is expansionary? So that would be cutting taxes, right, and increasing spending. So we need a combo of that. Decreasing taxes, that's B. But that doesn't decrease spending. So we need D, not B, sorry. So D is decrease taxes, increase spending. D is correct. And it says A and D, increase taxes, increase spending. I hate that because realistically, E is probably true. But what I'm going to do on the test is I'm going to clear E out and I'm going to put another wrong answer in there, because technically A, where you increase taxes by 100 and you increase spending by 100, that still expands the overall amount of output because it's the multiplier effect, right? We've talked about that before. So probably E is what the right answer is in the book, but I'm going to change that so that D is the only answer that's correct. Number 3. The cyclically adjusted budget deficit is an estimate of what the budget balance would be if real GDP were equal to its potential, if we were at kind of where full employment, right? We're not in a business cycle of up and down. We're just where potential is. So C. That one will not appear on the quiz because it's about cyclically adjusted. It's not really for our purposes. 4, during the recession in the United States, what happens automatically to taxes and spending? Automatically, taxes should go down and spending will go up. So that's D, and that's a great question. That's the kind of question you're really likely to see on a test, on an AP exam. They like to put these like double columns and make you match policies. That's pretty common. Number 5, which of the following is a reason to be concerned about persistent budget deficits? Crowding out's great. Government default means that they can't even afford to pay. So that's another one where you're worried about it. The opportunity cost of future interest payments, that's also true. Higher interest rates lead to decreased long-run growth. That's another true statement. So all of those statements are actually true for why we should be concerned about it. Free response number 2. Okay, let's take a look here. It says, in Module 29, you learned about the market for loanable funds, which is related to budget deficits. Use a labeled graph of loanable funds to illustrate the concept of a persistent budget deficit. Identify and explain the effect that they have on private investment. And so that is absolutely something we've talked about. Quantity of loanable funds, interest rate real, demand for loanable funds, and supply of loanable funds. And if the government's constantly borrowing, right, it's constantly pushing that demand out, okay? And it's pushing the interest rate up. And because I sub r keeps increasing, we'd say therefore investment decreases. And that's the idea that there's less available for them, and it's at a higher real interest rate. So it may not make sense for them to borrow. So that's that idea of crowding out. All right. Hopefully this helped you. See you next time.